By 2021, the FSOLDigital pool of artists was releasing music in numerous series, environments, from the archives, controlled vistas, calendar albums, re-recordings, Humanoid EPs on Detuned. Surely there couldn't be room for further series. Enter Mind Maps, the first 2 volumes of which we'll be looking at today on this episode of Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. FSOLDigital presents Mind Maps, release date 26th of June 2021. Martin Bolton broadcast the 4th Touch Music FSOL night via Mixler. As ever, a new mix was created by FSOL, and during the show Martin mentioned in the chat that he and the band were looking at the possibility of releasing the mix on Touched. There was initially talk of putting it out as vinyl, but for various reasons CD was finally decided on as the most suitable format, which makes sense given that it's a single 61-minute unbroken mix. The CD eventually came along in June 2021. With the track titles having been announced on the initial broadcast of the mix the previous year, it was generally known what was on the disc, and indeed a version cut into its constituent tracks does the rounds on peer-to-peer networks still. This single CD with no tracklist given format continued over to the next couple of volumes in the Mind Map series, which proved less popular with some tracks remaining unknown, but that's a story for another day, or at least later in the video. Grid Pattern's artwork is incredibly different to any FSOL artwork, with map photography and very different typography to usual. Although, once again, continuing through the series, it gives the Mind Maps releases a very distinct image, with the majority of the remixes provided by oeeeoou or Humanoid, and no FSOL actually mentioned on the release. It's yet another of the expanding FSOLDigital Presents family of releases which doesn't seem to quite fit into any conventional format. Not quite a compilation, not quite a mix, not quite an album. Just kind of is. I did a rundown of all the contents on this a few videos ago when I covered it as the launch night for Controlled Vista Picture Disc, so to hear the contents of the disc itself, why not pop over to that. Touch Music, FSOL Night 5, the 25th of June 2021. To promote the release of Mind Maps, a 5th Touch Music FSOL Night was broadcast, featuring an exclusive mix, once again, and closing with the CD released on the Touch Music Bandcamp. At this point it began to feel like there would be a never-ending cycle of touched mixes, with Mind Maps itself broadcast to promote the release of Controlled Vista. As is usual for these shows, plans are on hand to record the mix, and a copy has since circulated as a bootleg. There was some speculation as to whether this was going to be the by then announced Mind Maps 2 release, but both Brian and Martin denied this. Although, interestingly, some large chunks of the mix would later end up on Mind Maps 2, with the two sharing roughly half of their material. It opens with the then unreleased Waltz version of In Solitude We Are Least Alone, first heard shortly before as a snippet on one of the NFT artworks launched by the band shortly before the mix, and later appearing on Environment 7.02. A more electronic version with additional synths, vocal melodies, and none of Ravenbush's violin, it offers a very different spin on the track. Then it's onto a brief abstract environment with a couple of vocal samples from the Galaxial Pharmaceutical. No track names were given by Martin during the mix, although Brian offered me information about a few of the pieces, including the second track, a collaboration between oeeeoou and Alina Calancia, one of the staff at Digitana helping develop the SX1 and Halia synths. It's a dark, heavily textural IDM piece, not too dissimilar to many pieces released by the band at that point. It closes with the first answerphone message in the mix, leading into an environment of crackling fire, a sample of 1993 horror B-movie Warlock the Armageddon, When the Sun Emerges from the Darkness Your Time Will Pass. It's a pretty creepy sample, one that calls to mind the band's mid-90s film quotes. A brief synth ambient piece plays, with further answerphone messages on top, leading into 2021 calendar track Mock Guxtlook, and I can't believe I'm back to saying that again. At the time a Forest Trails track, although later reassigned to FSOL. A beautiful piece for piano, synths and down-tempo beats followed, with an answerphone message from Buggy at the start. It's a lovely mellow track and much needed respite after the intensity of the previous couple of pieces. Willem de Ridder, better known to FSOL fans as the narrator from Electric Brainstorm Volume 5, makes a brief appearance at the start of another answerphone-based environment, And then it's time for a collaborative piece by Dan Pemberton and FSOL, Long Green Field. An ambient track based around heavily treated piano, more abstract, less overtly melodic than the Views pieces. It's another that ended up on the second part of the Environment 7 trilogy. And I'm really giving away some spoilers for the future here, so I hope no one's really caring too much about what I say. Next up is a pretty ambient environment with synth pads, distant rumbling percussion, chirping insects and string sounds. It creates an atmosphere reminiscent of some of the Electric Brainstorm mixes, sound not heard for a few years at this point. It leads into another unknown track, a down-tempo piece for odd-sounding drum machine hits playing a slightly dubby rhythm and synth arpeggios. After a brief alien-sounding environment, an unheard remix of Mountain Goat comes along, later released as Mountain Path, with a chopped-up guitar riff and containing some elements of Forlorn, leading to some speculation as to whether Mountain Goat could be the track reworked for 2022's Record Store Day release. Another spoiler, it wasn't. Then it's back to more totally new material with a piece full of lo-fi drum machines, distorted samples and plinky synth arpeggios. It closes with an answer phone message inviting the band to visit Beat Farm Studios, possibly the very message that led to the recording of Visual Attack in 1991. An unreleased remix of a Sick Ones track opens the second half of the mix, followed by a short ambient piece with field recordings, acoustic guitars, chanting and a sample of a man saying time is irrelevant. Then it's time for a Hauntology style track, the first from the band in a long time, with a piece for old rhythm machines and 70s sounding analogue synths, bearing a heavy cluster influence. The mix's next hint of Environment 7 then appears with the chunky beats of Ritualized. It closes, leading into an environment for clattering sounds, analogue synth oscillations, and, you guessed it, more answer phone messages. Then it's mine and Brian's Apertures track, Missing Skies, or the second half of it at least. The Earthbeat computer offers advice about data connection at the end, which doesn't seem especially relevant for a Mixler show, but it's a nice wink to the past. And then there's what could be a remix of Max, certainly using some of the same string sounds with new piano and guitar melodies. It's a really beautiful moment, and of all the pieces on the mix I'd love to see properly released, this would probably top the list. The unreleased material continues with Exist to Remove Doubt, a track will also end up on Environment 7.02. Then there's a minute of beautiful lush ambience before a tiny point of light suddenly appears. The inclusion of such an old, familiar piece is quite a surprise at this point in the mix, although it becomes quite humorous when it morphs into an utterly intense track that starts off in grotty industrial hip-hop territory before heading into a crazy IDM workout, only to suddenly mix back into a tiny point of light once more. One wonders whether Diane Harris would approve. After a brief synth arpeggio environment is the full final piece of the mix, an alternate version of I Am Error with distorted glitchy beats. The final environment of field recordings, answer phone messages and melancholic synths brings the mix to a somewhat understated close. On the whole, despite containing some familiarly contemporary FSOL and Humanoid sounds, the mix feels like a subtle shift away from the timbres of then recent releases, with more in the way of deeper melodies and rawer sounding beats, and overall a richer, lusher texture than some of the very minimal music released between 2017 and 2020. FSOLDigital presents Mind Maps 2, the 12th of November 2021. 31st of August. Martin Bolton casually mentions a Mind Maps 2 CD coming on Touch Music before the end of the year. Given the then current release date, fans are relatively unsurprised. The general belief was that it was going to be the mix played to promote the first Mind Maps CD, but that was denied pretty early on by both Martin and Brian, although the truth is somewhat closer to the speculation, as between half and two-thirds of the mix does come from that earlier one, albeit chopped up and sometimes played in different orders, with a handful of new pieces thrown in for good measure. As for the first Mind Maps, the general theme is remixes. Once again, the CD comes as a single hour-long track with no added track list. And once again, there's no official explanation for this decision. I've tried getting an official track list, I promise. As with the first volume, the CD-only release went on sale directly after the Mixler show, with the 500 copies selling through in about 24 hours. The CD art matches that of the first volume, with more satellite imagery given digital colouring. The featured artist list is longer this time, though both 8818er, and I'm still saying that apparently, and B-Dog seem to have appeared from the Ether. Grid Pattern claims he was given them, while Brian claims they were added by the designer. Another journey through uncharted soundscapes with the Future Sound London, Humanoid, Yage, Synthi, Apertures, 8818er and B-Dog. 5 symbols along with the Touch logo appear on the back. A further 100 copies were reissued a couple of years later. The first volume had been pretty popular, so it's not surprising a second came along. The series had been initiated by Martin, who had loved a controlled vista and suggested further mixes in the same direction, using the fragments of answerphone messages that gave the 2020 release such a distinctive and intimate sound. With this second disc, Martin's influence grew deeper, with him hand-selecting artists and tracks from the Touched Music catalogue to be remixed. The Mind Maps title, too, came from a back and forth between Martin and Brian, with numerous ideas suggested before the final title came along. The earliest track from this era, one that had helped spark the idea, was the remix of Lottie M5, a track Martin had written as a tribute to his dog Lottie, who just sadly passed away. Brian's unexpected second remix as Synthi A provided the inspiration behind the idea of furthering the remix concept into a series of albums. Mind Maps 2 is probably my favourite of the touched-related mixes up to this point, with an excellent array of different sounds and textures that create a fairly consistent tone throughout. The 3 remixes for touch music artists near the start aren't my cup of tea at all, not being much of a fan of that particular kind of polished IDM sound, but otherwise I think every piece here is excellent, and although it doesn't quite work in the way a traditional album does, it's the closest these mixes have come to creating a sound like the classic ISDN transmissions. There are still a few pieces that remain unidentified to this day, making a track by track a little more difficult. JT and the Bee, Angel Moss V3 Age Remix. Mind Maps 2 pulls no punches in starting, cutting pretty much straight into a remix of JT and the Bee's Angel Moss. The childlike, playful collaboration between John Tejada and Plaid collaborator Bennett Walsh is, even in its Yage remix format, so utterly un-FSOL in sound that it provides a real what the fuck moment right at the very start of the mix. Oboe and violin lead the way, with mid-tempo IDM rhythms in the background. There's then the usual answerphone message before heading straight into the second track. EXM Depth Light Yage Remix. Touched, although in some ways a diverse label, does have a particular focus on shiny melodic sounding IDM, with sounds often reminiscent or heavily inspired by the late 90s and early noughties, and this track is no exception. Once again, it's incredibly un-FSOL-like in its overall aesthetic and melodic sensibilities. The use of breakbeats does break up the sound a little, adding some textual variety from the sound of the CD overall. After an answerphone message from Rob Manley, we get Humanoid's Hisaikam and FSOL's In Solitude We're Least Alone Waltz, the latter being the start of the first 13-minute chunk of the Touched Night 5 mix. Alina Calancia, Alchemy, Yage, FSOL remix. After a couple of spoken bits from the Galaxy Pharmaceutical comes this remix, which, as previously stated, was originally announced as a collaboration between Calancia and Yage. This track was later released on her 2023 tape Alchemy, and at that point identified as a Yage remix. It takes the sparse, glitchy original and adds layers of reverberated synths, voices and samples, creating a spookily dark piece reminiscent of travelling down a long tunnel. It closes with the Warlock the Armageddon sample. Unknown. The first unknown track of the mix is a stunning minute-long ambient synth piece, melancholic pads playing with a voicemail from an unnamed individual inviting the band to join in a project that would contextualise their work alongside other experimental musicians and filmmakers from throughout the 20th century. It's a brilliant piece, I'd love to know what it is. Mott Guxtluck from 2021's Calendar follows, and I'm never going to say that again. Cue it turning up on the next Music from Calendar's compilation.
You may remember me from a couple of years back, knocking on your door and interviewing you for a wonderful and brilliant project that was finished but never distributed. Came around and interviewed you and lost it, and we both, all of us, lost it, and it was wonderful, but there we are. Anyway, so...
Hyojin, Shall We Go There, Yage remix. Hyojin, having remixed 8818 a Humanoid around the same time, this remix in return features the duo's rich, beautiful, glossy, melodic IDM piece, which is a world away from the usual FSOL sound. Again, mid-tempo and emotionally affecting. The Willem de Ridder sample and Long Green Field also follow as heard on the previous mix. Sol AR Skies follows, at the time thought to be an alternate mix, but I've just compared the waveforms and it's actually identical to the covert version. Unknown. His intention, wanting to make beautiful objects, was originally heard on the Electric Brainstorms 12 and leads into an otherwise unreleased track with manic chopped up breaks continually alternating with an atmospheric synth pad. It's slightly reminiscent of some later Calendar Albums pieces, but with the thick, compressed production sound of much material from this era. The continual back and forth between beats and atmospheric textures really reminds me of Fractional Difference. Wouldn't like to think which alias this track belongs to. FSOL maybe? Might even be another remix, who knows. A voicemail from Richie, probably Richie Thomas, played over the end. Then there's an answer phone message of someone shouting, "Oi oi oi, you Scottish bloke, oi Scotty," undoubtedly from someone desperate to get in touch with Brian.
Come on, I know you're there. Come on, oi, 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 you, Sky's bloke, oi, oi, Scotty.
Sick Ones Unknown, Yade remix. Not part of any of the released Sick Ones remixes, this drum and bass track is as short and sharp as the band's hardcore originals. Unknown. The voice saying time is irrelevant, back to the previous mix again, opens up this unknown environmental ambient section with familiar frog samples, pensive acoustic guitar strums, quiet synths and chanted voices over the end. A strange piece, and a wonderfully odd one. Unknown again. It's time for the Hauntology style track. The cluster influenced rhythm machine and 70s analog synth one also featured on the previous Touch Music night. And it closes with a broody environment featuring spoken words, followed by the third space of a partial illumination track, Exists to Remove Doubt, and Missing Skies from Apertures once again. Unknown. A voicemail from Sweden announces this stunning piece, which sounds like a remix of Max. Once again, one that I described only a few minutes ago.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth. I'm calling from Sweden, and I'll probably call you back tomorrow. Otherwise, my number is 009-646. Hi. The Future Sound of London, I Am Error, alternate version. Another piece from the previous Touch Night, utilising the snaky flute from I Am Error, but instead of heading into the slow chugging beat of the final track, goes into something much faster with manic beats and blasts of noise.
Unknown. Mind Maps 2 closes on 3 minutes of ambient environments with running water, dramatic synth chords, a woman saying the future. A voicemail from Ruth, previously heard on Controlled Vista, is one of 3 that plays, followed by some lo-fi noise to end.
The future.
Touch Music FSOL Night 6, 12th of November 2021. Following the trend of past Touch releases, Mind Maps 2 was launched with a broadcast on the Touch Music Mixler page, followed by the albums released directly afterwards. The night began with a warm-up section of 3 FSOLDigital era tracks: Recollection, The Empty Land, Drifting In and Out, followed by an 8-track mini-mix by Martin Bolton, once again based around FSOLDigital era material, including a preview of Sand Dunes, due for release a few weeks later on the Touched Music compilation Project oeeoou. The mix also included a Humanoid track, Static Objective. Then the bulk of the show was a debut broadcast of the entire Mind Maps 2 mix. Over the closing moments, an announcement was made. Environment 7 will be a trilogy, with the first part, Rituals, coming in early 2022, a 2 LP reissue of Earthbeat will follow, and FSOLDigital will be offline for maintenance soon. A wonderful bit of unexpected news to close the night, even if 3 years later that FSOLDigital maintenance never seemed to happen. And then just as people started to leave the Mixler room, a bonus 25-minute mix began. My track-by-track description at the time was Serengeti, a synth track with intense arpeggios, an almost synthwave style analog synth piece, Nagware, slow glitchy piece, Dan Pemberton and FSOL Behind the Eyes from the Cold Cut compilation. Remixes, compilation tracks and reissues. Another year, another selection of touched and touched adjacent remixes and compilation tracks, as well as the launch of a new musical project and a track released on a Cold Cut compilation. It's arguably the strongest run of one-offs in the band's history. Min-Y-Llan, Lot E M5 rebuilt by Humanoid. Released on Lot E M5 Remixed. When Martin Bolton's beloved dog Lottie died, he paid tribute to her by releasing a 7-inch lathe cut with 2 remixes of his piece for her, Lottie M5. Brian was one of the remixers, and his track is a stunner. Transposing the original melody over to piano gives the piano an immediately melodic air, with pads, a chunky breakbeat, and deep synth notes taking over. It's probably the furthest from the classic acid sound that Humanoid has ever travelled, but it's a beautiful track and a highlight of the recent remixes. Humanoid, oeeoou. I think Brian's taking the piss at this point. Released on Tales of the Unexpected, the second dog-related Humanoid track of the year. oeeoou appears on a charity compilation for Dogs Trust, released by Pulse State, a label with ties to Touch Music. oeeoou, his name almost certainly an onomatopoeic description of the wobbly synth melody used throughout, is one of the strangely sparse, atmospheric, skittery Humanoid tracks along the lines of Tiny Machine Birth and other pieces on a Controlled Vista, with a strangely pensive mood. The various melodic and rhythmic elements are constantly changing, creating a lengthy track that keeps the attention throughout its 8-minute runtime. Min-Y-Llan, Lottie M5 Synthi A remix, released on In-Volatile, also known as Lottie M5 Synthi A Analog Designs. First heard on the first Mind Maps mix as Lottie M5 Synthi A Analog Designs, this is one of several remixes Brian created for Martin Bolton after his dog Lottie died, the first of which I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, and was also a trigger that started off the Mind Maps series. Bolton's melody is used to trigger the Synthi AKS, overlaid with new arpeggios, creating a stunning synth piece. The use of breakbeats is a new element for Synthi A, moving it away from purely using the Synthi AKS, although in remix form that's obviously acceptable. A beautiful track, finally given a standalone release on the Min-Y-Llan album In-Volatile. The future sound of London, Sand Dunes, released on Project oeeoou. Project oeeoou is a 5 CD compilation album for a girl called Una, wheelchair bound and with a still undiagnosed disability whose parents pay thousands a year to help treat. Martin Bolton arranged the compilation for release on his Touch Music charity label, with all money going to help pay for her medical care. Many of the artists on the album chose to sample Una, and one of them was FSOL. Her voice can be heard throughout the piece as a single repeated note. Behind this, rich synth pads and chunky breakbeats lead the rest of the piece. There's more than a touch of the band's 90s sound of the track, with the beats in particular not sounding at all more like the IDM leaning pieces of late. The chords and airy synth samples are incredibly beautiful, placing the track in the emotive FSOL tracks category. Not the most heavily populated box, but totally fitting for the content. Daniel Pemberton and FSOL, Behind the Eyes, released on At Zero. This one leads to an interesting question. Is the Views series complete? With background glitches as heard on many of those tracks, as well as the band's electronics, and of course Dan Pemberton's piano, it feels like an extension of the Views project. But with this and Mind Maps 2's Long Green Field also credited to Pemberton and FSOL, one did wonder whether this end of the group's sound is now getting its own project. Of course, the re-arrival of Views in late 2015 kind of put an end to that theory. Pemberton's playing here is particularly stunning, with some wonderful electronic treatments, samples and textures. Largely uplifting, with a bittersweet kick, especially in the acoustic guitar section that appears in the second half. It feels like the next development in the band's intermittent modern classical direction, and a very welcome one. An album of compositions for piano and machines like this would go down an absolute treat. It appears fittingly on an album of ambient classical works compiled by Cold Cut and Mixmaster Morris. For the CD edition, all tracks are shortened as part of a seamless mix by the curators. All label profits are donated to mental health charities Calm, Campaign Against Living Miserably, Mind, and Black Minds Matter. Ma, or Matt? M-A? M-A in a circle. Anatano Sekinin. Released on Dyadic, a label run by Touch Music's Martin Bolton and David Watson, aka graphic designer Grid Pattern. This track went under the radar initially. As part of the label's Addict compilation, it could easily have been just another underground artist. It was only with the release of Mind Maps 3 in 2022 and the reveal that Matt is a collaboration between Martin and Brian that people started really paying attention. As for how it sounds, well, it's not really that far off your usual Mind Map style piece, unsurprisingly. Richly melodic, quietly bittersweet, with some unconventional shimmering hi-hats in the rhythm, and subtle but beautiful vocal samples. Future Sound of London, Accelerator. While Accelerator's original and reissue pressings always sounded pretty good, despite cramming 52.5 minutes onto a single slab of wax, There are definitely some who are audiophile enough to want to be able to have the album on slightly better quality, and so a double LP edition of the record was issued for Record Store Day 2021, with 10 tracks spread out over the 2 pieces of vinyl. There are fewer crossfades between environments and tracks here, making it slightly less traditionally FSOL in tone, although with a better deep bass response, undoubtedly the go-to version for those particularly obsessed with sound quality. Of course, some people are never satisfied, and one Discogs reviewer complains that the tracks are on the same side as each other are still linked together. Someone who clearly really doesn't get what FSOL are going for at all. The Amorphous Androgynous, The World is Full of Plankton. Brian and Gaz got the rights to the full Alice in Ultraland sessions returned to them in 2020, giving them the opportunity to put out either a reissue or an expanded version shortly afterwards. This never happened, although it did at least appear on Bandcamp. And for Record Store Day 2021, a 10-inch release featuring 3 tracks, The World is Full of Plankton on the A side, All is Harvest and The Emptiness of Nothingness on the B side, were released in a run of 1,000 machine-numbered copies. With the artwork simply copying images from the original Alice in Ultraland booklet, there's nothing particularly new here, but it's nice to see The World is Full of Plankton getting a bit more attention. And we'll close on something a tiny bit different, a Mixler broadcast by Roll Funken on 20th of March 2021. While not a touched music night, with all the tracks here being selected by Roll Funken, and mixed into a seamless 4-hour DJ set with some superb blending between the tracks, the show did have something in common with the Touch Nights: exclusive tracks. For the mix, Roll was provided with 4 exclusive unreleased pieces to play. This ensured a fair number of FSOL fans tuned in. The first was Icicle, so a brief ambient piece with a plucked melody. The second was called DW Pulse, the DW referring to Doctor Who, and the piece being a big dramatic analog synth track featuring elements of the classic Doctor Who theme. My guess is this might have been a Dan Pemberton collaboration, maybe? Third track was UV Dark, an acid piece, surprisingly for a mix of all FSOL material, and the fourth title wasn't announced, and I described it as super fast IDM beats. None of the pieces have been released since, interestingly. And that's your lot for this week and for 2021. Drop me a note down below, I'd love to know what you think of the music discussed, the Mind Maps series. These seem to be extremely popular, so I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. There's also like, subscribe, share, you know the deal by now. Give my channel a boost. I will be back next week, and we'll be moving into 2022. And finally, Environment 7. So I hope you'll join me for that. Martin Bolton broadcast the 4th touched music. Great first sentence of the main video. To promote the release of Mind Maps, I'm going to turn off the amp before it turns itself off and makes a noise. On the whole, despite containing some familiarly contemporary... Oh, I cannot say familiarly. And of course, Dan Pem's Pimpy Poo, FNA.